Hi, welcome to Counterpunch with Trevor Loudon. Please like the show, share the show. We are the show that exposes the ongoing world communist revolution. Now today I'm going to talk about Barack Obama. It blows me away that Obama could be the president for 8 years, be on the stage ever since, manipulating things from behind the scenes, running a shadow government. Really, he is the president right now. And hardly any Americans understand that he's a communist, that he's always been a communist. He's always worked in sympathy with the communist movement. So I want to give a bit of evidence today to back up that charge. Now, back in November 2008, Sam Webb, then head of the Communist Party USA, wrote an interesting article in the Communist Party website. And this is part of what he said. The left can and should advance its own views and disagree with the Obama administration without being disagreeable. Its tone should be respectful. We are speaking to our friend. Let that sink in, people. The head of the Communist Party USA is telling you that Obama, who was just elected, was a friend of the movement. Now, when Obama came to Chicago in the early 80s, he immediately hooked up with the Communist Party. He was working with people like Frank and B. Lumpkin, veteran Communist Party organizers, working with people like Addie Wyatt, who was a long-time Communist Party supporter, and also with the Lozano brothers. They were very deeply involved in the Communist Party. All of these people were around Obama. They helped him in elections. They helped support him. In 2004, when he stood for the US Senate, his precinct captain was John Bachtel, who was the head of the Chicago Communist Party at the time and later became the head of the Communist Party USA nationally. So he had no problem at all working and mixing with communists. So where did this communist background come from? It started before birth. His father, Barack Obama Sr., was a Kenyan economist. He came to Hawaii in the early 60s. That's where he met Barack Obama's mother. He was involved in demonstrations, rallies, peace rallies, etc., and was very much on the left. The whole Obama's family was on the left. They all were. But the real communist influence behind Barack Obama came when he was about 10 years old. Obama had been deserted by his natural father. The father had gone back to Kenya to become an economist for the government. He developed an alcohol problem, was eventually killed in a car accident. So for several years, from the age of about 10 or 11, about 1970, 71, till he left for Occidental College in 1978, Obama was mentored by Frank Marshall Davis. Frank Marshall Davis was a local Hawaiian activist. He was a black guy, a poet, and he was introduced to the young Obama by Obama's grandparents to sort of give him a black influence in his family.
At the time, a fairly well-known poet named Frank Marshall Davis, who had moved to Hawaii and lived there. And so I have a discussion with him.
Well, Frank Marshall Davis was a hardcore pro-Soviet communist. He joined the Communist Party in Chicago in 1943, possibly earlier, but we know at least in 1943. He came out to Hawaii about 1948. At the time, the Communist Party was sending people to Hawaii because they were anticipating Hawaiian statehood, which actually happened in 1959, I believe. And they knew if they could take over the Democratic Party in Hawaii, they would get 2 left-wing senators and a whole bunch of left-wing Congress members. They were also agitating in Hawaii to close down Pearl Harbor, because Pearl Harbor was a very important military base, and the Soviets wanted to get as much of the American military out of the Pacific as they could to allow them to conquer that area. So there was a very deep communist plan to put cadre like Frank Marshall Davis into Hawaii. Now, Frank Marshall Davis was active in the Hawaiian Democratic Party, as most of the communists were. But in the mid-50s, there was a big FBI crackdown on the Hawaiian Communist Party and pretty much destroyed the organization. The FBI was also very, very actively surveilling Frank Marshall Davis for many, many years. They had him on the security index, meaning there's a special index, meaning that if war had ever broken out with the Soviet Union, he was considered such a dangerous communist that he would have been arrested that day. They observed him photographing obscure geographical features all around Hawaii. And I think the inference they made that might have been military intelligence, military espionage, photographing these geographical features which could come in useful for a future military invasion or something similar. But anyway, he was a hardcore communist. He mentored Obama for about 8 or 10 years. Obama refers to him in his autobiography, Dreams from My Fathers, as just Frank. He wasn't willing to put the whole name down. He wasn't willing to be associated with a known communist. But he talks about how he got guidance from Frank, he learned a lot of politics from Frank, etc. Frank Marshall Davis was definitely his mentor. And I discovered this connection back in 2007 in a Communist Party publication where Gerald Horne, a big-time Communist Party supporter and a historian, gave a talk at the Tamiment Library in New York where the communists leave all their papers for posterity. And he talked about this relationship between Frank Marshall Davis and a young Obama and how historians would talk about this meeting in decades to come and how significant it was. Horne didn't mention that Frank Marshall Davis was a Communist Party member. He just said he was in the orbit of the Communist Party, but he was a communist. Frank Marshall Davis was still listed as an endorser of a communist front, the American Committee for the Protection of Foreign-Born, at least as late as 1973, 3 years after he met the young Obama. So Obama is indoctrinated, I believe, by Frank Marshall Davis. Then Obama leaves Hawaii, goes to Occidental College. And you can see this little clip here by my friend John Drew. He was a young communist, a young Marxist at Occidental College and mixed with Obama and his friends. And it's very clear from what John has to say that Obama was a hardcore Marxist-Leninist by that time.
I met Barack Obama through Caroline Boss, a long-term girlfriend for about 2 years. She was definitely a hardcore Marxist revolutionary. Barack Obama drove up to the Boss's house with his friend Hassan Chandu. And I knew Hassan Chandu from the earlier anti-apartheid movement, but Barack Obama was a complete stranger to me. He was very tall, very dignified. He was dressed really well, like a GQ model. Caroline, while we were standing outside waiting for Chandu and Obama to come into the house, had told me that Obama and Chandu were with us, meaning that they were part of our radical, revolutionary, Marxist-Leninist cohort. So they were in our secret club, basically. And we were smoking cigarettes, having a good time. They were talking about how there was going to be a revolution and how the revolution was inevitable. So I thought, well, this is my opportunity to enlighten these three young people that they were wrong to anticipate a violent revolution and that there were better ways now to bring about socialism that were more practical. And Barack Obama was furious. He looked at Caroline Boss, and I still remember these words all these years later. He said, "That is crazy." He was almost demeaning me and demeaning my intellectual contribution by saying that everything he had read from Francis Fanon, who was a third world revolutionary, was completely against what I was saying. And so that's where I started making the case empirically. You know, look at what happened in France. Look at what happened in Germany. Look at what happened in England. None of these places have had revolutions. But I could see with Barack Obama that he was listening and that he was absorbing my arguments.
You were debating with Obama not to tell him that socialism was not the goal or communism was not the goal, but a violent revolution wasn't the way to achieve it. What do you think Obama got out of that debate?
The way to achieve socialism was through working within the Democratic Party and pulling it further and further towards the left.
So then Obama goes to New York, and he attends the Socialist Scholars Conferences in New York, which were run by Democratic Socialists of America, but not limited to DSA members. They had Italian communists there, communists from all over the world, effectively. And this was the kind of circles Obama was mixing in. But it was really when he went back to Chicago that things started to pick up. I've mentioned, of course, some of the prominent Communist Party members that Obama was associated with. But really, there are two people who had a massive influence on Obama that really show how deep this communist connection was and how prepared these people were for the coming of Obama. I believe Obama was nurtured from a very young age to fulfill a very important role. You see this happen a lot in communist circles. They love to pick up young Latino or black radicals, they draw them into Communist Party circles, and they use their union influence, their church influence to elevate them, to get them elected to offices, and advance them until they're very important people. You see this time and time again. People like Andrew Young, who was the mayor of Atlanta for some time, was an example of communists helping somebody to get to a high position of power. So the very first one I would mention here would be a man called David Axelrod. Axelrod was the man behind Obama's 2 elections, the man who got Obama elected to the US Senate. Now, Axelrod had a very interesting history. He's from New York originally. His mother was Myrtle Axelrod. She used to work for a communist publication called PM. It had people like I.F. Stone writing for it. I.F. Stone, the famous Soviet agent and iconic journalist. PM also had writers like Earl Conrad, who used to also write for Negro Story, a communist magazine which Frank Marshall Davis also contributed to. So when Axelrod came to Chicago to study at the University of Chicago, to study journalism, he was already on the left, but he was picked up and mentored by 2 guys, Don Rose and David Cantor. They ran a publication called the Hyde Park Herald. They mentored the young David Axelrod. Now, Don Rose was an extreme radical involved in several Communist Party fronts. He was heavily involved in the rioting that shook Chicago in 1968 at the Democratic Party convention, when the Weathermen and their friends went absolutely ballistic and caused huge damage to that city. He was the man who coined the phrase, "The whole world is watching." That was Don Rose. David Cantor was also very interesting. David Cantor was the son of Harry Cantor. Harry Cantor in the 1920s was a leader of the Boston Communist Party, and he ran into a lot of trouble. He got jailed for a year for sedition, I believe, and then he migrated to the Soviet Union and took his whole family with him to Stalin's Soviet Union. So little baby David was brought up in Moscow, effectively. Now, while he was there, Harry Cantor, who was a printer, worked as a translator, and one of the works he was commissioned to translate was Lenin's collected works from Russian into English. That is a very plum assignment. That's not given to anybody. Harry Cantor would have to be a very prominent communist to get that kind of job. So in the late, I think it was just after World War II, the Cantors moved back to the United States and they settled in Chicago. And Harry Cantor was very involved in the Communist Party in Chicago. And he took over a publication called the Chicago Star, a communist publication. And the reason he took it over, because its publisher, Frank Marshall Davis, was just about to leave for Hawaii. So Harry Cantor knew Frank Marshall Davis. Now, David Cantor grew up, went to university in Chicago as well, was very active on the left, and joined the Communist Party. In the early 60s, David Cantor and his friend Leroy Wolins, another communist, had a company, a publishing company, Translation World Publishers, and they would publish Soviet literature. They would publish, articles praising the Soviet Union, etc. And they were actually required by the US State Department to register as Soviet agents at one point. I don't know if they actually did it, but they were told they had to. One of the little publications released in 1963 was a little book under the pseudonym John Smith. It was called the Birch Push Plans for 1964. And what it claimed was that the John Birch Society, a very, very effective anti-communist organization at the time, and still very effective in pushing back socialism and communism, was planning to do a seizure of power on the back of the Barry Goldwater presidential campaign of that year. All completely bogus, of course. Barry Goldwater was Reagan before Reagan. He was Trump before Trump. And he was a very staunch conservative, sort of libertarian leaning, but very anti-communist, very powerful orator. And he was going to be running against John F. Kennedy in 1964. But of course, John F. Kennedy was assassinated by the pro-Soviet activist Lee Harvey Oswald, by the way. Goldwater ended up running against Lyndon Baines Johnson. And of course, there was massive sympathy for the Democratic Party ticket, and really Goldwater had very little chance of winning. And one of the main problems Goldwater had, he was blackened extensively by organizations like Translation World Publishers as a radical, racist, pro-bomb right-winger.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9,
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other, or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
The propaganda campaign against Goldwater was massive. And if anybody lived through the campaign against President Trump, you'll know what I'm talking about. It was exactly the same. This has been going on for a very, very long time. Anybody who's against communism can expect to be slandered and smeared and criticized non-stop. If you're not being criticized and you're the president, you're not opposing communism. It's as simple as that. So this organization, David Cantor, was a big part of the smear campaign against Goldwater. And his protege, David Axelrod, made his name getting people elected by smearing their opponents. David Axelrod managed Barack Obama's US Senate campaign in 2004. The Republican opponent was smeared viciously. Sealed divorce records were released that painted the candidate in a very bad light. David Axelrod, his method is to smear his opponents, just like he did against Mitt Romney, just like he did against John McCain. And he learned his art from a Soviet-trained communist called David Cantor, a man who was required to register as a Soviet agent. This is who David Axelrod learned his trade from. Now, there's another very important person in Barack Obama's life. She was his brain in the White House. That's what they used to call her, Valerie Jarrett. She lived in the White House. She still lives with the Obamas. She introduced Barack and Michelle Obama. She was their matchmaker. If anybody is the two people most responsible for Barack Obama's rise to power were David Axelrod and Valerie Jarrett. But what about Valerie Jarrett? Well, Valerie Jarrett was the granddaughter of Robert Rochon Taylor. He was the first black head of the Chicago Housing Authority back in the 1920s, 1930s, and an activist. He was involved in several Communist Party fronts, some of them with Frank Marshall Davis. Now, he was also very well connected to a man called Alfred K. Stern, a housing activist identified by the FBI as a bona fide Communist Party member and a Soviet spy. Stern eventually was chased out of America. He fled the United States to escape prosecution, settled in the Soviet Union, and eventually communist Czechoslovakia, where he died. but he was in contact, very close associate of Robert Rochon Taylor, Valerie Jarrett's grandfather. Well, Valerie Jarrett's father, James E. Bowman, was a medical doctor. He was involved with the Association of Internees and Medical Students, which was identified by the FBI as a Soviet front, a communist front. It was affiliated with the World Federation of Democratic Youth, which was the International Soviet Youth Front. He was also identified by the FBI as being in contact with Alfred Stern, the Soviet spy. So Valerie Jarrett's father was involved with a Soviet spy, and her grandfather was involved with a Soviet spy. Now, Valerie Jarrett briefly married a man called William Jarrett, also a medical doctor. The marriage lasted about 5 years, so that's how she got the name Jarrett. Now, William Jarrett was the son of a man called Vernon Jarrett, a very prominent Chicago journalist. Jarrett was a big-time supporter of Barack Obama. The very last thing that Vernon Jarrett did when he was dying of cancer in 2004, he wrote a column from his deathbed urging the black population of Chicago to get out and vote for Barack Obama in that year's US Senate election. And of course, Obama prevailed. Well, Vernon Jarrett had a very interesting history. He was also, back in the 40s, and I believe for many years afterwards, a Communist Party member. He was also on the security index, just like Frank Marshall Davis. Had war broken out with the Soviet Union, he would have been arrested that very day. Well, it also turns out that Vernon Jarrett worked for a publication called the Chicago Defender, a well-known black newspaper. Frank Marshall Davis also wrote for the Chicago Defender. When the Packing House Workers Union went out on strike in 1948, the Packing House Workers was a communist-controlled union. They formed a publicity committee to put out the union side of the story, to put out their propaganda. And on that publicity committee served Vernon Jarrett and Frank Marshall Davis. So Vernon Jarrett knew Frank Marshall Davis well. So isn't it interesting that the two most important figures in Obama's rise to power, David Axelrod and Valerie Jarrett, can both trace their family histories back to the Communist Party USA, and specifically to connections with Frank Marshall Davis, who went out to Hawaii and just coincidentally happened to become the mentor of Barack Obama. Now, this could all be complete coincidence. But if you believe that, I have a bridge in Brooklyn that I'd really like to sell you. So if you look at Barack Obama's career, what he did to this country, he did massive damage to the US military. He empowered the Soviet Union. He empowered the Soviet Union, Russia. He empowered Russia. He empowered Iran, which is Russia's ally. And he was, caused massive racial division in this country. He introduced socialized medicine. He basically destroyed America's ability to control its borders, which was a long-time communist program. He did everything the communists could have possibly wanted. If Fidel Castro or Vladimir Lenin had been in the White House through the Obama years, I doubt you would have noticed any policy differences whatsoever. So when Obama was meeting in Russia, and you've got to understand, although Russia is not so-called communist right now, it still has the same foreign policy it had in communist days. Vladimir Putin, the head of state, is a KGB man. He is still supporting communist causes all around the world. Russia is allied to communist China, allied to communist Cuba, allied to communist Vietnam, allied to communist Venezuela. Russia, for all intents and purposes, as far as foreign policy goes, is communist. So when Obama had his meeting with Dmitry Medvedev, the then Russian president, and made this famous statement, when he thought no one was listening, remember the statement?
My last election, yeah. After my election, I have more flexibility. Yeah, I understand. I transmit this information to Vladimir and understand it.
Was Obama talking to his bosses? How else can you explain that statement? We know Obama is a communist. We know he's worked with the pro-Soviet Communist Party USA most of his life. He was a red diaper baby. He was born into the movement. Was his allegiance always with Moscow, or was it with Washington? Was it with this country? By their fruit shall ye know them. And I would say Obama's fruits prove pretty clearly his allegiance was never with this country. So I hope you found this interesting. I hope you understand Barack Obama a little more and why America is now in the pickle that it is. So please share this video, like the show, pass it around. More people need to know this stuff. So thanks for watching, people. Tune in for the next episode of Counterpunch with Trevor Loudon. God bless America and God bless all of you. Thank you.